Hi, Trade Guys listeners. I'm Naveen Girishankar, president of the CSIS Economic Security and Technology Department and the host of CSIS's newest podcast, Betting on America, where we explore the global technology race and what it'll take for the United States to come out on top. Join me as I sit down with leaders from business and government to understand the risks and the rewards of investing in the technologies and industries of the future in a community near you. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to learn how and why we are betting on America.
I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
This is Trade Guy Scott. Welcome to the latest episode of The Trade Guys. On this episode, Bill and I introduce Phil Luck, who is the new Scholl Chair in International Business at CSIS, a real economist, unlike Bill and myself. He joins the Trade Guys when we talk about all matters with the Tariff Man and a new topic, the reprise of the Plaza Accords and whether or not there will be a Mar-a-Lago Accord. All this and more on this episode of The Trade Guys. Welcome to this episode of The Trade Guys. This is Scott. Bill's with me, and also we're joined today by the new Scholl Chair in International Business of CSIS, Phil Luck. Phil, thanks for joining the program. Why don't you tell the audience who you are and what your plans are, and look forward to incorporating you in our conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Scott. Really excited to be here. Yeah, I'm Phil Luck. I've been here at CSIS for about 2 months now. I was most recently, before that, the Deputy Chief Economist in the U.S. Department of State, where in the Office of the Chief Economist, we basically helped the department think about issues where economics interacted with foreign policy. So now I'm doing that, hopefully, from this new perch here at CSIS. Prior to that, I was an academic economist teaching in international trade. So thrilled to be here. It's a bucket list item to be on with you guys. So thanks a lot.
We're happy you joined us.
It's nice to know we're in your bucket.
Bill, you probably spent very few hours of your waking life not focused on what's happening on the trade front. It's hard to keep up if you're not standing right by the levers of power. So what's your take on Mexico, Canada, and all matters Tariff Man?
Well, it just keeps getting stranger and stranger, you know. This week we've seen the steel tariffs were up to 50% with Canada, and then they went away. You know, it's hard for reporters to keep up. They just wait an hour and the story is going to be different. I think what's beginning to happen now that they've gone into effect, you're beginning to see reactions from other countries, and it's a mixed bag. Canada has retaliated. The EU is retaliating, which has led Trump in turn to threaten counter-retaliation. There seems to be a trade war on liquor forming. We put tariffs on steel and aluminum. They retaliated with steel and aluminum, obviously, but also on spirits of various kinds, particularly whiskey, which Trump, who doesn't drink, seems to have a thing about. And so today, we're recording this on March 13th, he threatened 200% tariffs on French wine and other spirits from Europe. The best comment came from a representative of DISCUS, the Domestic Spirits Council in the United States that represents the American producers of wines and spirits, who said, we want toasts, not tariffs, which I thought was probably the most appropriate reaction. We'll see if he actually does it. Then we'll see if the Europeans counter-escalate. Maybe we'll have a real trade war that we can talk about next week. That will be quite exciting. Most of the other countries are holding fire. Australia's not doing anything. Japan is not doing anything, at least for the time being. Mexico is waiting. India has not acted. Brazil is unhappy, but has not taken a definitive stand yet. So Vietnam, Korea, I think it sounds like a lot of these countries are going to kind of open a new chapter here, which is to come in and ask for an exemption. This was the game the first time under Trump and under Biden, and a lot of them got them. And this time Trump says no, and he told the Australians no because they already asked. But somebody asked me earlier today, is this all going to end in negotiation? And I said, I thought Canada and Mexico will, and China, because I think those are leverage moves. But the other ones, it's going to be a different kind of negotiation. It's going to consist of countries coming in and, kneeling before Tariff Man and offering up concessions, and then for him to decide if it's good enough or not. That's his preferred model,
It seems to be. And, the strangeness of all this is there's not a functioning dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO. I was kind of amused when I read the headlines this morning, and plucky Canada has appealed to the dispute settlement process that doesn't operate for us on the steel and aluminum tariffs. So I'm not sure what help there is from external agreements or any of the past to what we've relied on for 50 years or so. So is anybody talking about that in Washington, or is this just bilateral bargaining is what we're descending into?
Nobody has mentioned the word WTO in Washington in some time. I took it as a good sign. Most of us took it as a good sign that Trump has nominated an ambassador to the WTO, which is a sign that he doesn't intend to leave, at least not right now. But the cases are piling up because it's not just Canada.
Right.
China already filed one on the other tariffs, so it's going to grow. Phil, how do you see this playing out?
So, I broadly agree with you. The first thing I would say is beyond the palace intrigue and the will they, won't they, the war. This is going to be economically quite costly to the U.S., right? Estimates suggest that steel and aluminum prices are going to go up by 6 to 8% on these things. There's no good exemptions process right now, so this is going to be very costly. The estimates that I saw from the first steel and aluminum tariffs in the first administration, 2018, estimates suggest that they destroyed about 75,000 jobs in the United States. So, we're going to have some cost here. And, one number that I always like to cite is that steel tariffs are not just bad because they raise the price of steel. Steel is used in almost everything, right? So it's going to increase the prices and reduce employment in industries downstream. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by almost everything, the industries that use steel intensively, employment in those industries outnumbers employment in steel 80 to 1. Mm-hmm. So for every one job in steel production, there's 80 jobs in industries that intensively use steel. So this is going to be costly, right? And that, again, that's before you get to retaliation. That's before you get to whiskey and all the other things. So I don't know. And then to Bill's other point about, maybe the Mexicans and the Canadians will negotiate. Definitely think the Mexicans will. Mm-hmm. The thing with Canada right now is you've just got a lot of anger, a lot of public anger. And, the politicians sort of have to echo that in some way. And then also, when I've talked to Canadian officials, they've basically said, okay, we negotiate, but to what end? Well, how can we believe kind of anything he tells us, right? Because if it's steel and aluminum today, it's reciprocal tariffs tomorrow.
Uncertainty is piling up.
Yeah.
And I think you're exactly right. I had a Canadian visitor yesterday who said, you Americans don't really understand the depth of Canadian disappointment and anger with the United States over, severing a long relationship. And, just eliminating the tariffs, if that were to happen tomorrow, that's not going to undo the damage. They view this as a betrayal. And the irony is it's been enormously helpful to Trudeau's party politically. Single-handedly, Trump has brought the Liberal Party back up into leading the Conservatives now there. He's did the same thing in Ukraine with Zelensky, with the people who were thinking about arguing that it's time for an election, saying now is not a good time for an election. I don't think he understands soft power,
Well, one of the things that was part of the original executive order on Canada and Mexico, and I haven't heard anybody but Kevin Hassett talk about it, is fentanyl and border security between the U.S. and Canada. And yesterday, Kevin brought it up again in one of his TV interviews. And that seems to be the ignored issue here. And I know there's been some attempt to minimize the amount of fentanyl intercepted at the border between the U.S. and Canada. But the border measures are so different, U.S.-Canada, than U.S.-Mexico. It's an unfair comparison. And my sense is that there's nothing there. And there ought to be an interest of both countries to work on both border security and getting the poisons like fentanyl out of our system. But I never heard that come up in the debate. Is that not real? Or we just don't want to do anything about that? Not we, but the parties involved. What's your sense, Bill?
It's part of the negotiation, no doubt. There's been surprisingly little information about what they're negotiating.
Yeah.
Canadians have come to town, Mexicans have come to town, and they've gone away. And nobody's really leaking on what they're talking about. My sense in those two cases is, there are deals out there. We've had differences on a lot of issues with them for years, and we usually find a pathway to resolving them. I think the biggest one outside of the fentanyl and migrant issue with Mexico, the biggest one is using Mexico becoming a backdoor for Chinese imports, which Trump wants to stop. I think the Mexican government is going to be sympathetic to that. How you get from, yelling at each other. The Mexicans are not yelling. They're being smart about this. But
yes, right.
How you get from today to an actual serious negotiation about substance, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. And I would say, Scott, your original question about sort of the fentanyl, I would really separate the Canada and Mexico issue here. By all metrics that I've been able to get my hands on, there really is no issue with Canada here. There is, tens of pounds of fentanyl have crossed the border over a course of a year or so. Like, it's just almost nothing. That's not to say Canada doesn't have a problem with fentanyl, but they are doing the exact same thing we are, which is importing precursors. Canadians are producing fentanyl for Canadian consumption, and then some export, but not to the United States. Illegal migration, similar, very, very, very low flows over one of the longest borders, in the world. So it's really not a real issue. The other thing I would note is, we actually did have a bit of a problem with illegal border crossings between Canada and the United States last summer, right? So there was an issue where, foreign nationals were flying into Canada and then, crossing the border. This was an issue with certain visa policies that Canada had. It got bad enough that it sort of, got on the radar of the Biden-Harris administration, and there were pretty serious talks, and they were pretty seized on this. And Canada worked with us, and we solved it, right? The reason that that's probably news to most of your listeners is, we didn't have to threaten 50% tariffs to do it, right? This is diplomacy, right? This is what happens, right? There's always going to be bilateral irritants. You don't usually have to, whip out the nuclear trade option.
That's a really important point that doesn't get made enough. I think on the current situation, anybody else, if you just asked the Mexicans and Canadians, do you want to negotiate? They would have said yes.
Yeah, sure.
This is not Trump's way. Trump's way is bully, threaten, take measures. He could have just asked them, and I think we'd be in the same place.
And you'd probably be focused on the things that really matter to you. For instance, I don't understand tariffs on aluminum from Canada at all, because it's a completely integrated industry between the U.S. and Canada. I mean, it's the same company. It's the same labor union for the workers. It's just, I don't know how you do that. So it's never made any sense. But we can't seem to set aside the nonsense to get at what's really the nub of it. So I guess it's time to negotiate, but there'll no doubt be more drama. We're in perils of Pauline mode. So,
well, and meanwhile, as Phil says, there's going to be losers.
Yes.
There's going to be the sleeper issue here, which he alluded to on steel and aluminum, is this time around, our tariffs are covering downstream products. So it's not only the fact that the tariffs are going to make steel more expensive for people that make things out of steel, they're making those things more expensive. So if you look at, I think we were making fun of this last week, if you look at the list of items covered now for national security reasons,
right,
we're cutting, including knitting needles, crochet hooks, stoves, other appliances. I think toasters are probably on the list.
Classic dual-use products.
Yes, right. All, no comment about that.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm speechless. But it means that prices are going to go up.
Yes.
The basic ingredient is going to be more expensive. The end product is going to be more expensive. And the retaliation is going to be more expensive. And plus, there are things we actually buy from these countries.
Yes. Quite true.
The most conspicuous one that I thought, which is obvious if you think about it, is iPhones, which come from China. Now, 20% price increase on iPhones. That's not peanuts.
Right. Well, it's something we'll continue to discuss because this is what the guy does. So we're in for an entertaining 47 months ahead of us. So
yeah, one more thing on that I thought was interesting. There was a note about this, a little postscript to this question of who actually pays. And it turns out, Phil, you may want to comment on who pays, but the story was that Walmart, which has a lot of market power because they buy big, went back to their Chinese suppliers and asked them to eat the tariff. Asked them to cut their prices so that Walmart didn't have to increase its prices. And they were hauled in to talk to the Chinese government, who complained that they were doing this and trying to put the burden on the Chinese. And I don't know what Walmart's response was, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I don't know how much of this is going to get passed on.
It'll be an interesting thing to look at. I mean, in the first tariff war in 2018, the first round of papers from the economics literature came out pretty quick. So I'm sure that people are downloading the data and doing the analysis right now. The one thing we can say from that, the first round of tariff wars against the PRC, we paid the vast majority of those tariffs in 2018, right? If there was any sort of confusion or question in the literature, it was honestly, the question was, how on earth are we paying so much of these? How is the pass-through rate really 95%? So it really was quite high. We'll see what it looks like with Canada and Mexico. But one thing I'll note too on the Canada and Mexico case, which is a little bit, there's similarities to the PRC tariffs, but there's some differences. One difference is just how integrated these supply chains are, right? I was just meeting with representatives from sort of the heavy trucking industry that does a lot of co-production between, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And, their products, their engines that are, produced in the United States, they cross the border 5 to 7 times before they're entirely, assembled, right? So you put tariffs on each one of those, that's a lot, right? they were thinking that this could increase the cost by almost $30,000 for some of these heavy trucks, right?
Oh, my.
Yeah, it's going to affect the auto industry. If you look at trade numbers for the state of Michigan, you'll find that you have the same effect where you have deeply integrated production systems. We'll have to continue to track this carefully and find out when reason begins to prevail, if ever. Now for something completely different. We had a new topic. It's Bill's choice, so I'll let Bill start on it. It's called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which now, of course, we have a Treasury Secretary who's talking about rebalancing and the need for that. And it's been 40 years since James Baker led a rebalancing effort, which included the so-called Plaza Accords. So 40 years. Wow. So what's happening here, Bill?
Well, first, we have to sort out rebalancing because Trump talks about rebalancing with tariffs, and there he's talking about trade. This is about money. This is about rebalancing the value of the dollar. And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. The idea of the supposed Mar-a-Lago Accord would be a reprise of what Scott referred to, the Plaza Accord, which was in, I guess, 1985, in which basically our allies, primarily Japan and Europeans, agreed to an upward appreciation of their currencies vis-a-vis the dollar and a depreciation of the U.S. dollar in an effort to reduce our trade deficit and, in a sense, rebalance the relationship between our economies. And there's talk this time of trying to do the same thing, which immediately runs up against Trump's repeated statements that he wants a strong dollar and that he believes in a strong dollar. And the idea of this accord is to really to force a weaker dollar. And the key word, I think, when you start talking about the details is accord, because accord means the parties have to agree.
Right.
And there's not a lot of signs that the other parties, one of which would be China this time around, it was Japan the last time around. I mean, Japan will be in it too, but they'll agree. And all signs are that China views the Plaza Accord as having been a disaster for Japan, that it led directly to really 20 years of economic stagnation. I'm not sure that the numbers support that. The Chinese think that, and they're not excited about an accord that would ask them to do the same thing. And if you get into the details and say, well, how are we going to do this? The Trumpian approach tends to be typical Trump, which is all threats and demands and not concessions.
Yeah, I would take the most extreme position.
So what does this mean? How do we get them to agree to support dollar depreciation? We attach a user fee on foreign holdings of U.S. treasuries, and we twist their arms into lengthening the maturity of the treasury holdings they already have. And in a sense, starting to talk about the 100-year bond. I don't see a lot of enthusiasm in other countries for, that kind of structure. And I don't see you getting to an accord by trying to force these people to do things that they manifestly don't want to do.
So this may be stillborn, or you think we're going to have talks that lead nowhere, or what's your sense of this?
I don't know. Nothing's gotten off the ground. This is people talking about it.
Yes.
But one of the people who has talked about it is Stephen Miran, who is, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is in line to become the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. So it'll be certainly something talked about in the White House. To me, the fundamental oddity of it is that it depends on basically acknowledging that the right answer is a weaker dollar, which also gives me a chance, just as an aside, to plug next Tuesday at 9:30, we're going to have an event at CSIS with Paul Bluestein, who has written a book entitled King Dollar, which is history of the past and future of the world's dominant currency. So if you want to find out what's going to happen about this, tune in next Tuesday. Phil, you must have thoughts about this. You're a real economist as opposed to Scott and me.
No, I agree with everything you said. To your point, there's, in my opinion, a fundamental misunderstanding that the problem here is the dollar's too strong, that problem is, the source of that is somehow that, we are not being helped by the prominent role of the dollar in the global system, but in fact hurt by it. I would strongly disagree with that last point. I think it's immensely useful to the U.S. to have the dollar be the international both reserve and currency of transaction. It allows us to borrow very cheaply. It allows us to, be really dominant in global trade. And then to the broader point, I think what Stephen has sort of argued is, well, one way, this is the sort of clever bank shot. One way that we won't pay for these tariffs is by, devaluing these currencies against the dollar. And therefore, that'll allow us to pass these things on. No discussion of how that affects our competitiveness of our exports, but that's a separate topic. But then the other point I would make is that I think this is sort of confusing the use of tariffs and sort of the bilateral trade deficits, the sort of source of it, which largely speaking, this is a macroeconomic phenomenon. This is the sense that the current account deficit is a flip side of the financial account surplus, right? We borrow far more than we earn, right? We're stocking the market with treasuries. We continue to ask people to buy these. That increases demand for dollars. And if we put less treasuries out there, that would reduce that. There's a fiscal solution to this, which is some fiscal sanity, and it's not something you can solve with tariff necessarily.
It's like not continuing to run a fiscal deficit, so 6% of GDP would be a good thing.
That would help. Yeah, exactly.
That would help. Well, we'll have to wait to see more of this. And Bill, congratulations on one of the finest shameless plugs ever inserted in the program. I hope people listen early enough that they're able to take advantage of this, or I'm sure you will be able to listen to the recording of the program on csis.org.
If you come in person, copies of the book will be available for sale.
Now, there's a draw.
And we at CSIS make no money on this. This is just trying to get an education out there about the dollar and about currency.
That's excellent news. Well, we'll definitely have more to talk about next week, but Phil, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on becoming the new Scholl Chair, and we look forward to your work over the years to come.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, and we have 3 Scholl Chairs sitting here.
Oh, wow.
I was before Phil, and Scott was before me. So
right.
That's got to be a first, right?
That's right. It's sort of the Mount Rushmore of Scholl Chairs, but...
Oh, I wouldn't go that far.
Without the Mount.
I'm not going to touch that one.
All right. Well, we'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.